But I feel like the number of people who call their like robot vacuums like Rosie is just
Right.
through the roof. And it's like, all right, well, we have that part of the show now. So every little piece, in my little like tracker in my head. But, you know.
That's welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So today, Association of Payment Professionals monthly educational webinar series. We do need another hero, how the payment industry can stop illicit activity that fuels terrorism and other crimes. Today, I'm happy to announce that we have a great presentation. Whoever's advancing the slides, if we can advance it to the next one, I'll go through APP's little spiel that we always have at the beginning here. Wonderful. So just a reminder, Associated Payment Professional is a member-based and volunteer-driven nonprofit committed to safeguarding the payments. As you can see, we've got a myriad of people that love to come to all of our events. And again, we do appreciate you coming today. Next. Upcoming webinars. So June 4th, we've got Unmasking the Unseen. And then July 16th, we have a compliance presentation titled "Still Be Determined." Check back at paymentpros.org to get more information on that. And then some other of the upcoming events will be on your little calendar invite or your little calendar area there on Payment Professionals. Next slide. Hoping this will be coming up. Yes, Mac Academy. Yes, fully launched. Great content. Everything's live. So we have 3 modules there, and we have even more coming. More information again at paymentpros.org. Next slide. This is the one I'm most excited about. So we officially have our regional roadshow laid out. So we will be in Salt Lake City area at Security Metrics office down in Orem. I'm excited. I've never been to that region, so I get to go travel there. So August 20th, it will be at Security Metrics office. Thank you very much for our sponsor for that. Atlanta, we will be there September 16th and 17th. We will have the event tied to a half-day event at MasterCard. So thank you to MasterCard for coming around and being able to support us. So more information to come on that, but it'll be a half day on that Monday, and then the APP event will be at the MasterCard office in Atlanta on that Tuesday. And then we're going back to Dallas for the Midwest. We will be back up in the Frisco area at Fortis Pay. Again, thank you so much, Fortis, for coming around and getting us that space. It was a great opportunity to be there. So more information to come. Keep an eye all out for it. I believe registration will hopefully be opening up, if not by the end of this week, definitely next week. So thank you all for considering coming to our regional road shows. Next slide. As a reminder, volunteer opportunities. We've always got options for everybody if you're interested in committing just 5 or 10 minutes of time a month, or if you're interested in being more involved. The biggest ones that I could say is that we've got a variety of committees. And again, they're all volunteer driven. So again, appreciate all the support. If you're interested, give us a ring and we will find an opportunity for you. Next, I believe we might be, yes, I'm happy to introduce today our speakers. So Ben Decker at Memetica, hope I pronounced that right, and then Maya Shabi over at Eversay. So with that, I think that's all of our slides. Thank you both for coming today. And a couple quickie things, sorry, housekeeping items. We will hold all questions until the end of the presentation. However, there is the Q&A and there is the chat option. So you're welcome to put some questions or insight into those areas. We will have a moderator who will be going through those and answering on the spot. But for questions specifically for the speakers today, we'll hold those till the end. So Ben, Maya, it is all yours. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Julie. We're glad to be here. Ben, I'm going to pass over the baton to you if you want to speak a little bit about Memetica and your passion that led you to founding the company. And yeah, I'll give a little background on Eversea after.
Sure. Thanks, Maya. So my name is Ben Decker. I'm the founder and CEO of Memetica. We're a threat intelligence group founded in 2019, focusing on strategic response issues related to targeted harassment, corporate risk, disinformation campaigns, and violent extremism. So we have a threat intelligence vertical as well as a lot of tech policy consulting and sort of specialized investigations. And my sort of entry point into this, after a research fellowship at Harvard and a stint reporting with the New York Times, I became the target of a Russian state-sponsored media harassment campaign and received a myriad of violent offline threats and realized there weren't really a lot of strategic solutions available. And as this trend has kind of increased, we've really built out a cultural ethnography of a bunch of different threat actor communities across the internet and really value the opportunity to work with strategic partners like Eversea, but particularly Maya. She and I, come from sort of adjacent backgrounds, and it's been really great to, reconnect in the terror finance space in these wild and wacky times we live in.
You just called us both nerds, and I like it. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of what Eversea does and what I do. First and foremost, Eversea, we're focused on powering growth for the e-commerce system with trust and confidence. And what that involves is providing several solutions, one of them being a merchant monitoring solution, and we look for, the line of business, and we monitor for transaction laundering, and then we also look at marketplaces and try and fight illicit and counterfeit products on major marketplaces. And then we have that kind of third division similar to what Ben is doing with Memetica. It's risk insight services, where we have a team of investigators. And so, like, why am I covering our merchant and marketplace monitoring solutions within the context of this webinar? It's basically to demonstrate that we are a data company. So when we crawl and risk rank millions of websites and products every day, you're bound to uncover a lot of patterns and areas for our teams to investigate. So for me, this is where the fun comes in, and my role as a product risk strategist is I work with the product teams and R&D and our teams of investigators, and we go out there in the e-commerce ecosystem and try and disrupt bad actors. And I really enjoy the part of getting to advise and work with the teams in guiding how our solutions meet those needs of our clients. And that's where, again, it's where the fun is. We get into the mindset of bad actors and the people being victimized in order to be effective fraud fighters. So, I know how vast the internet is, and there's millions and millions and millions of websites, but I think at the end of the day, every little bit counts. So we just, take it one day at a time, working with wonderful people like Ben, and we keep on going. So with that, we're gonna get into our webinar for a little introduction. Oh, also I wanted to point out that my favorite part about, my role with Eversea is that we push forward a lot of thought leadership. So that, involves doing reports on, global trends, regulatory trends. We host a Safer E-commerce Day in November of each year, and it's purely educational. We're not trying to sell you anything. We like to bring on speakers, our friends over at APP, Ben, to do segments and trying to come together as a community and just be nerds together, essentially. And it's a really great event, and I hope that we get to hear from you guys as we get closer to that date. A little bit of housekeeping. So let's get started. So we know that fraud remains one of the largest, if not the largest and most significant proceed generating crime for which funds are laundered, especially in the United States. We know that investment fraud and healthcare fraud remain the most prevalent proceeds generating crimes. But what about the other financial crimes, especially terror financing? Nefarious actors, they make billions of dollars by deceiving, government programs. We saw this post-COVID, private companies, individuals that send funds in a variety of different methods, and those funds are ultimately unaccounted for, stolen, diverted. And with that, we have the widespread adoption of Gen AI. It's supercharged fraudulent enterprises, accelerated the speed and sophistication of deep fakes, and it's really helped launch disinformation campaigns across the globe. And speaking a little bit to what Ben was just mentioning. So, if you consider how Gen AI is being leveraged by transnational crime groups specialized in money laundering, ChatGPT's OpenAI, and Microsoft, they confirmed that state-sponsored hackers representing North Korea, China, Russia, Iran, they've been utilizing GPT in order to support their malicious activities over the internet. So we're going to dive in a little bit, and that's what we want to talk about. And just a little bit more context. We are in a post-October 7th reality where we as payments professionals were faced with another watershed moment after a major terrorist attack. We saw that that's just no way of getting around it. We saw that with FinCEN's almost immediate response. They issued an alert to financial institutions regarding Hamas's money movement less than 2 weeks after the attack, which was, I think, record response from a regulatory and enforcement agency. And the risk of terror financing once again took center stage. And now in the months that have followed since October, anti-Semitism has surged on a global scale. Protests and conflict are dominating the newsreels. And so we as a community, we as an ecosystem of payments facilitators need to understand where we fit in. And also, we have to recognize that terror financing isn't exclusive to groups in the Middle East. It spans the globe. It includes a myriad of different violent and extremist organizations. It is a complex web of not just criminals and terrorists, but involves various industries and networks of both knowing and unknowing participants. And we will get to that later. So the topics Ben and I are going to cover today, it's not exclusive to terror financing. We're going to talk about it a lot, but the typologies we're going to dive into are used by organized crime syndicates, fraudsters, money launderers, basically everyone in the value chain that could hit the payment rails of both large and small financial institutions. So Ben, here we go. We study and track hateful and extremist rhetoric across platforms. That's more of Ben's space. I like to track and how they're moving and funding, their activities. And I'm gonna bring it back to the social media sphere, disinformation, conflict dynamics. We know that more than 70 countries are going to elections in 2024, and after the 2020 election, we saw what happened in DC, and that's largely due to social media and disinformation being spread across platforms, or we see it in 2022 with Russia's military campaign in Ukraine. We still see it happening. So let's dive in. Can we unpack disinformation and misinformation?
Oh boy. Let's unpack. Yeah, it's interesting because during my time at Harvard, my mentor, Claire Wardle, was the expert who came up with the original Venn diagram of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And we find it funny that it really still is kind of the bedrock, because it's really important, especially when we think about, things like payment platforms or, sort of more heavy-handed, decision making that happens on the internet, is thinking about user intent. And misinformation is kind of the stuff that, the garden variety thing that you see, it matches your worldview, you share it. Are you intentionally trying to deceive people by sharing something that you don't really know is true or false? Intent wise, not really. And I think disinformation is where we can really think about coordinated campaigns, sophisticated threat actors like, Russian, Chinese, Iranian influence operations, domestic and, foreign terrorist groups of, a wide variety of ideologies. And in a lot of ways, crowdfunding as it relates to all of these groups and disinformation, it, the disinfo, we can honestly even like avoid using that word to a degree because it's propaganda, right? And propaganda can have maybe a more it still has a negative connotation, but a more neutral vibe to we're telling a story to get people to buy into our idea.
Mhm.
So where do you spread that idea? Where do you gain an audience? You do it on social media. You do it on social media platforms that also have terms of service and content moderation exploits that are widely available. So those platforms end up becoming a funnel to payment platforms. So, we get a bunch of people to believe this thing on Twitter. Our ultimate goal is to funnel them through to either, a crowdfunding thing or our private social media that has its own, finance related mechanisms. And, as we sort of zoom out, when things go super viral on TikTok, that could actually lead to a unique uptick in payment activity in certain parts of the web. And I think it's really at that nexus point that, we've done some really rad work together. And in a lot of ways, what I like about it is how issue agnostic it becomes, right? So it's not just
Mhm.
about like a single geopolitical issue. It's not just about anything from like topics as, far on the spectrum as trafficking to, right, like eco-terrorism kind of stuff, right? Like it all sort of
Mhm.
fits this same methodology.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you guys seeing anything trending on major social media platforms or even fringe platforms as it pertains to, the upcoming election in November? You guys really got started in the post January 6th era, and watching these groups kind of grow and change and move. Is there anything that you're really noticing that sticks out to you right now?
I think one of the really interesting things that it's weird because we went from like Jan 6th to Brazil when Bolsonaro supporters tried to kind of do something very similar and in a lot of ways kind of took the internet playbook from the US, appropriated to Brazilian. And now, like, the messaging that happens online around it, a lot of it has become increasingly associated with the Russian, Iranian and Chinese, influence networks online. And I think what's super concerning is there's a lot of content that's created that's specifically targeting communities on fringe platforms where there's nobody guarding the door of that nightclub, right? So you can just
Yeah.
show up and do whatever you want. So all of a sudden you have foreign influence operators who are trying to ostensibly sow discord in various countries around the world. And they're able to do
Nobody's watching
whatever
out
they
for it, man.
yeah, I mean, like they can do whatever they want to do. So I think those trends, we think about the worst of the Russian security apparatus around the world as, assassination attempts, the paramilitary groups around the world. And I think in a lot of ways, social media is, I don't want to call it sort of like a softer offensive capability, but in sort of the influence space, being able to convince people who are more prone to, extremism and violence to actually buy into something.
Yeah.
that's really, really significant. And I think, in the payment space, I'm curious to start, looking at some more transactional information about different communities, because in the domestic terrorism space in the US, we have seen a lot of groups doing joint fundraisers between Five Eyes countries, interestingly enough. US, with like Australia, or New Zealand, and American groups, with European groups, and most of it's happening in crypto. So it's relatively traceable. But I think the foreign aspect is super it's super concerning, because we've seen what it's done in the past.
Oh, yeah, and that actually it's a nice transition into what I kind of want to dive into next, where you have this kind of connection between North American, far right extremist groups and your kind of traditional idea of what an international terrorist group is. You have your ISIS, your Al Qaeda, and things like that. But they share many things in common, right? Like they use propaganda and disinformation. They're trying to get their message out there and achieve funding, support, radicalize individuals to either join or conduct lone wolf attacks. It's been a very effective strategy over the years. And, they have familiarity with weapons in a lot of situations, an anti-government stance. But I kind of want to just focus a little bit about how these groups are structured, where, international terror groups, they're, generally those big names like I mentioned, and can be state sponsored in some situations, but their structure is usually more centralized command. They have logistical support. They need a very well-established infrastructure in order to maintain their operations, oftentimes like spanning the globe. We have the Islamic State that's active in many, many, many countries, whereas we know that their leadership primarily resides in Syria. And they get instruction and command from various aspects in regards to the leadership in Syria versus, the domestic terror groups, usually the North American based movement, where we see these extremist ideologies, and they're generally more decentralized. They're smaller. There was a lot of analysis that was done after January 6th, 2021, where they looked at the command structures of these groups, where they don't really have a leader. I think maybe Proud Boys had more of a central leadership. I might be confusing with another one. And they have more localized funding. So it's actually, it can be quite difficult to trace and find how they're moving money. Because it's at such a small scale, it's not going to trigger a whole lot of alarms. But what else were you seeing, like in terms of these connections between, far right extremist groups and, US based movements, and, the research that you guys did post October?
I think, when it comes to domestic issues, um, over the last 2 years, let's just even say three, um, the organizational structure of these groups has really been tested by, criminal investigations, or, you know, uh, criminal trials, frankly, and it's led to a lot of pivots in the way groups function. So they actually try to make things more decentralized in an effort to kind of avoid, more streamlined investigations, let's just say. And, I think it's been interesting because in the US context, they haven't moved away from crypto yet in the ways that international terrorist groups like Hamas have been kind of, off the crypto sauce for like a year or so. And I think that's where it gets really interesting, because depending on kind of the geopolitical context, you have these different preferences for, right, like which types of online financing you're going to use versus, and I don't want to kind of
Yeah.
put the cart in front of the horse, because I know we're gonna get into that a bit more. But it's really interesting because it's like how much are you concerned about being prosecuted and that or investigated? And I feel like the higher that concern is, the less likelihood that like cryptocurrencies are going to be, your number one choice.
Yeah, people started figuring out, oh, it is actually traceable.
Right.
Leaving aside the crypto mixers and all of those things, but we'll get into that. So I do want to do kind of like a little bit of house cleaning or just kind of set the base as we move forward. So, what is your terrorist financing? And it's, very basic definition. It's that financial support to organizations, groups, individuals for planning, preparing, and execution of a terrorist act. And then I want to kind of go over a little bit of why it's so important, because not only does it support their operational capacity or their ability to plan, but going back to what we were talking about, where there's a lot of propaganda and radicalization that comes with providing funding and how effective a strategy that is for those, domestic terror groups as well as the international terror groups. It's really just out of the playbook of how they're able to, to do anything online or in person. And I'm happy to provide more information about it later on for anybody who wants to inquire about any of these items here of why it's so important. I do feel like it's fairly self-explanatory. And then kind of the funding stream, of these are kind of like, where we sit is as payments professionals, once the transmission has taken place, that funding that's reached the organization, it's really, really difficult for us to insert ourselves as it's converted into, any kind of, logistical or weapons acquiring or whatever else. But where we can really disrupt and make an impact is in that acquisition and aggregation stage, and as it moves into the transition. And that kind of appeals or applies to many of these typologies that we're going to kind of go over. Terrorist financing, these aren't exclusive to terror financing, but extends to organized crime and other bad actors, and we're going to hit a couple of them. I just want to note that for time purposes, we're only going to cover a few so we can make time for questions at the end, so we can always come back to these. We're happy to send resources or answer questions about typologies not covered, but I do want to point out that there's a couple of them that sit a little bit outside of our wheelhouse, like state sponsorship or trade-based money laundering. That's mostly because, we deal in the online space and it's really difficult to investigate state-sponsored funding if you are not in an enforcement agency or regulatory or any kind of upper tier role. But we really look for things like, when it comes to crowdfunding and activity on social media. But before we get into these, I do want to mention the importance of gatekeepers here, especially as they pertain to evolving AML legislation, especially in recent years. So for those that don't know, gatekeepers, they're people or businesses in a unique position to facilitate transactions. So this can range from setting up offshore or shell companies to hide who's actually behind, where this money is moving. These people are really situated in that position, and they can be tied to organized criminals, sanctions evaders, terror groups, or even just the ultra wealthy. We all saw when the Panama Papers were published, the Pandora Papers, they exposed how attorneys and other professional service providers helped, the ultra rich in the world conceal their wealth. And as I'm sure many of you know, that the concept of being a gatekeeper, it doesn't really stop at a professional service provider. So like in the EU, regulators are designating digital platforms as gatekeepers. So if you provide an important gateway between businesses and consumers in relation to those services, it's really their ability to shape the online landscape that influences the global financial system. So we've got those massive online platforms, your metas, and then you've also got the people that sit within these roles that have an important role to stand up and say, hey, I'm gonna prevent whatever illicit activity from happening. I'm gonna prevent online hate and harm in various ways. All right, so I think we're gonna first dive into crowdfunding and donations. I'm gonna let Ben take the wheel over here because he's done quite an extensive amount of research on crowdfunding platforms.
Yeah, I mean, these are the kinds of things from an evidence perspective that in
Mhm.
the lead up to like a major flashpoint or offline event, they're really useful in sort of building out an understanding of these groups. And oftentimes, right, that comes from publicly available locations. Obviously, websites for groups is really, really helpful, like the Oath Keepers militia in the lead up to January 6th had all of their financial, footprint information literally on their website, which is super helpful because you can look at traffic to it, traffic out, going to, right, like, certain payment platforms. And I think the other is like, well, understanding like how popular are these types of groups? How big is their audience online? Like, what does it mean to have 10,000 Twitter followers? It's like, well, every time they post a link to fundraise for XYZ campaigns, like they're getting a ton of traction. So, and then we can kind of look at the history of what those kinds of things actually are. And sometimes like groups do, legitimate humanitarian work, right? And I think it in lots of ways it makes it really easy to sort of create a cloak or veil over some of the underbelly issues like trying to overthrow government or threatening violence against protesters and using fundraising money to buy military equipment, right? Like these are the types of things we don't really know until afterwards, but these types of forensic footprints can be really helpful. In a lot of ways, like these kinds of campaigns are really an open call to action for anyone willing to take a bite out of the propaganda apple, let's just say. And depending on what kind of group it is, I think in some of the more global terrorist groups, they do actually provide instructions sometimes on how to increase your anonymity and ensure that these kinds of things are not traceable. So sometimes a group jihadi number one posts something to Telegram and says, hey, buddies, like, let's get some new donations in this week. Can you post this to Twitter? So then jihadi two and three are posting things to Twitter to try to get, supporter A, B, and C to join the Telegram to then get instructions on how to tumble and mix a certain type of cryptocurrency donation. And then all of a sudden, right, our investigative red string map is built out more with a bunch of different platforms that we didn't necessarily think about. So ultimately, right, there are ways that we can kind of hide the goals of what it is, but there's also a lot of times where there's actually just instructions on how to ultimately make it harder to discern the fact that you're doing a not good thing.
Yeah, well, and we also know like regulation is inconsistent across the globe when it comes to how they treat crowdfunding platforms, donation platforms, and unless it's, a global platform like, on social media or something like that, that has that kind of, standard AUP, there's really nothing we can do unless everybody kind of gets on that same page. Okay, this is violent rhetoric, this is extremist, this is, and really connecting the dots. And what makes, Memetica so important in this case of really needing to track how they're advertising or spreading propaganda and advertising, how they're going to collect donations or crowdfunding platforms. Especially, after October 7th, when we really started paying attention to just how it just caught on like wildfire, how they were doing this. So it's connecting to the next typology that we wanted to explore is that social media appeals. So, I mean, even separate from facilitating money movement, you know, the role of social media platforms and appeals when it comes to hate and harm. And you had mentioned this earlier in the challenge of content moderation. How do you see that working out?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to note, and I'll admit my own, subjectivity in that, but like the platforms and, global policy initiatives are trying hard, and there are, a lot of like really legitimate and sort of public-private, private-private partnerships that are in place. And I think over time we'll be able to do some monitoring and evaluation to see how impactful things are. But yeah, I mean, the reality is we can look at social media platforms like a marketing funnel. And there's often things that you can do, right? To like, if you have automated content moderation and less actual humans doing the work, you can kind of figure out how to exploit the system. Like, oh, if I just spell this with a three instead of an E, like I'm good, and all these different things. And the goal is, the more public facing a bigger platform, like something owned by Meta, you're using that platform to get people to a more closed space like a Discord or a Telegram or a WhatsApp or even a Signal group or something for that matter, and eventually kind of get people to less and less and less moderated spaces so that they can more authentically express themselves in, ways and norms that otherwise are not okay. So like one of the simplest things that, we often do is we'll just look at, outbound links to specific entities, and all of a sudden you're saying, oh wow, like this group is actively, right, like trying to pull people from one place to another. And the more closed spaces you are, that's where you share the bank instructions, right? That you share all of the very deliberate ways for humans to do something. Or it's like, click this site, use a, Tor, and after these three steps, like you're good. Like we need money for XYZ. And it's crazy to see people just posting, banking information into these places. But, I think once there's that perception of like, comfort and safety and, an unmoderated place, right? That's where the, exposure comes out.
That is crazy how openly people post banking information or external links, and finding an automated solution, a scalable solution to be able to scan the millions of accounts on various platforms. It's rough to say the least. And then another one that I really wanted to hit in this talk with you is remittances and Hawala. So kind of along the same line of the informal money transfer system, whereas the social media appeals and getting links to something that's a little bit less moderated, where they can share a PayPal account to send money to or something like that. We have hawalas or remittances where typically it's more referring to how migrants will go abroad and they'll work for a while, they'll send money back home to their families. It's really, really common practice in the Middle East, in the US with Mexican migrants and so on. But what we're seeing on a much more massive scale is CMLOs and how they're employing informal money transfer systems to move money across borders, particularly for drug cartels in the Americas. So CMLOs in this context are, Chinese money laundering organizations. They're professional, they're connected. And so what they do is they're able to move money without really ever crossing borders. So they can penetrate their competitors' market at a lower price point, and they provide rapid payout options, but they basically mirror transactions within various countries. So like in the US, for example, if it is dirty money from, narcotic sales, that money will remain in the US, and it's, for the most part, broken down in smaller amounts and deposited into US bank accounts opened by money mules. So that's that kind of concept of smurfing. But given that this kind of system of transferring money, of laundering money for drug cartels in the US, it's, extremely relevant, given that the biggest narcotics related challenge currently facing North America is the fentanyl crisis. It's that fentanyl that's synthesized by Mexican drug cartels moving their way up into the US and Canada. And we know that they buy precursor chemicals from Chinese organized crime syndicates, but CMLOs are moving their money. And if you guys haven't read it, I highly recommend. This is a really big feature in the US Treasury Department's money laundering risk assessment this year. But really just kind of attacks how, and this, again, it's not relative to just terror financing, although it's very much used within the terror financing realm of using, the Cash Apps, the Wise, all those other things, of being able to use those different platforms to move money, but also they're specialized groups that will do this on such a global scale. And I'm going to move a little bit quickly so we can make time for questions at the end. But Ben touched on this a little bit before with charities and NPOs, where it is something that's kind of come up in the news a lot in recent months. And, post 9/11, we saw how nonprofits and, 501(c) charities were being exploited to conduct the attack in 2001. And in this case, it's, especially within the context of the, Israel-Gaza war, that, it's really, really hard to discern whether or not a charity or a nonprofit is connected to a terror organization or connected to an organized crime group, because they could be doing really, really good work. They could be providing, medical aid all over the world and whatever else. And so it's, FATF and all these different organizations have put out guidance and how you should monitor these groups and vet them, and in particular to the transaction level data going on behind what these groups are doing. But it's an absolute typology for, major money laundering operations and terror financing groups, unfortunately. And then the final one we're going to cover today is marketplaces. So marketplaces, I think we know they're abused by all sorts of bad actors, big and small. We see it on major platforms and moving counterfeit products. We see them on, vacation rental marketplaces and websites, things like that. Like within the context of terror financing, Hezbollah's system usually includes, counterfeit goods. They have a massive infrastructure in Latin America, Lebanon, US, Europe, and they sell counterfeit CDs, clothing, food, cigarettes, things like that, and they can generate millions of revenue. Out of Iraq and Syria, we've got terror groups that are dealing in the antiquities trade out of those countries. And marketplaces really face a huge challenge because it's, especially when it comes to third-party sellers. And of course, they want to onboard as many as they can and generate a lot of transactions and a lot of traffic. At the same time, there's a lot of regulatory focus on making them responsible for the products moving through their platforms. They're not just a facilitator anymore. Now they are a responsible party. So we're going to see a lot of shifts, I think, over the coming years of how products and how marketplaces are really going to be working, especially within the context of terror financing, very, very soon. Okay, and so I do want to make our talk a little bit more positive and give some action items for our crowd today of how we can work together. So one of those things is having investigative awareness. So we can all, as a community, as an ecosystem, put on our investigator hats and keep out keep our eyes out for signs of suspicious activity. So oftentimes that involves paying very close attention to the jurisdiction or the situation connected to any merchant or transactions. And we're bringing into for the payments people here. So an example of that being, operators of pig butchering schemes, for example, is, they take advantage of special economic zones as a base to run their scam centers. And while, at least for my part, can't dismantle those operations, we can at least, provide information, look out for red flags to give over to enforcement agencies so that they can start connecting the dots and actually take down these groups. And it's also really important to recognize the importance of jurisdictions, especially, as they play the role, as hubs of illicit trade, and it can often involve sanctions evasion or exploiting free trade zones. We know that threat actors often rely on the use of complex business structures. They use multiple front companies, sometimes registered in offshore havens. And, without that, I mean, we kind of have our little list here of high-risk jurisdictions and things to look out for. But I want to make sure to note that there's a destabilizing effect that illicit trade operations can have. So, they'll look for areas that are near conflict zones, and there's high level of violence that are committed by traffickers or corrupt police officers and security officials. So it's never really like isolated in one area. It's really all kind of connected, and there's a ripple effect by all of it. And then on the situational side, you've got to be able to recognize the typologies of funding, know who you're dealing with, the different types of actors. Are they an organization, or is this more individual based? And then understand also the current and emerging trends that are going on with the different types of investigations you're trying to conduct. And then finally, I'd like to go over a couple of best practices and policy perspectives. First thing is, we've mentioned it multiple times during this talk, is, increased cooperation and information sharing between all of us. While Ben and I, we operate in different spaces, we share our research and we can strengthen our respective detection tools. And so that's only facilitated by that bit to private participation. But when we understand that bigger picture, we can become more effective disruptors within our spaces. And it's not exclusive to private partnerships, but it should and needs to extend to the public sector as well. As much as I would love to be able to take down malicious websites, it's not in my wheelhouse or my capabilities, but I can report suspicious activity to the people who can disrupt them and take them down, and or at the very least help them make more and well-informed decisions. And then if you want to take the next couple, I know you've got a lot of thoughts on these.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's an interesting year in tech policy, particularly with the DSA rollout in the EU and the Online Harms Act in the UK, forcing some degree of regulatory compliance around specific types of content. So I think that's going to be really interesting to watch how things unfold. But we're still in this whack-a-mole moment where you can kind of get away with certain things on one platform that you might be booted off of from another. So, threat actors can just sort of hop around from platform to platform. So being able to really truncate these together into some coherent policies is ultimately, the goal, I think, of where we'd like to see things going. And, the reality is, I think a lot of people say, oh, well, let's just remove them from, this metaphorical bar or, public park or something. But the reality is, the further we move people, sort of offline or out of the circle, it means we don't have visibility into what they're actually doing. And, how can we sort of monitor for risk without insight into what's happening? So I think at the end of the day, right, this is not, we don't talk about this as a means of being sort of exclusionary or creating an internet right that is, doesn't exist with people who, are of a certain whatever. I think that the goal is actually, inclusivity and making sure that everybody's kind of operating right, and there are just certain rules and norms that are kind of, abided by. Because I think at a lot of points, and we do a lot of work with platforms and some work with governments, and being at the table with everybody, everyone sort of pledges to do the right thing. At the same time, some might be under-resourced to actually implement some of these policies, and others might actually avoid altogether sort of culpability. So I think that there's a real wake-up call that's happening now with respect to how do we look at certain internet service providers and cloud hosters, and if there happen to be a couple companies who are just, you know, known for hosting any certain types of, international terrorist content or trafficking forums or things like that, like how does the collective community of, internet policy sort of respond? So I think, in the violent extremism space and the sort of live streaming of terrorist acts space, we've had a lot of progress, with through the Christchurch call, an initiative by the New Zealand and French governments, which has signed on from, I believe, 120 companies, including most of the major tech companies and payment platforms, I believe, as well. And I think that more of these kinds of sort of global community initiatives that involve a number of sort of weird people looking at the internet like myself, alongside the established companies, governments, and everyone else, it allows everyone, to have sort of a say and figure out ways to figure out what does emergency reporting look like from any stakeholder, and how do we actually, implement action? What does rapid response of a whole industry look like when it's happening together? And I think, like, from what we've seen, it's really good, and I think so much can happen. But that's does require will, resources, and kind of everything else.
Well, yeah, and that's especially true with like how we're able to spread information in almost real time, so that emergency reporting can really happen on a rapid scale. If, like you said, if the proper resources and support is put towards it. So it's kind of hopefully a more bright future. But I agree. I think that there is a lot more focus, I think, that needs to be paid to, or attention that needs to be paid to those, those web hosting and registrar companies in terms of the role that they play in how disinformation and violent or extremist content is spread. And, hopefully the payments industry also kind of catches on and is able to influence the decision making in the future. But speaking of, the payments monitoring, there's a couple of best practices that I wanted to kind of leave you guys with. So when it comes to, all of the topics that we've discussed today, things that you can implement on your side is, monitoring for, those sudden or unusual changes in transaction velocity. So if we're talking about, a major event, understanding, what's the kind of bar for normal transaction activity with that merchant account or whatever else, and seeing if there are any spikes that kind of follow close to the date or around that, or shortly after. And that could be, spikes in, auth attempts or high decline rates or things like that. And this can also extend to, new or inactive merchants that suddenly become active. You'll see possibly, transactions with rounded sales amounts, a significant number of low value transactions. That should be another red flag. And then also kind of take a look at the average elapsed time between authorization and settlements of transactions. We're not a transaction monitoring company at Everseed, but you do, when you work enough with payment professionals and with our clients that do monitor transactions, you really do get to get insight into these kinds of patterns or these red flags that you can look for that really do point towards potential illicit activity. So I'm sorry, we've only left a couple more minutes for questions, but we can certainly open them up. And of course, if we don't get to them, we are more than happy to follow up in an email or provide more information any way we can.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you so much, Maya. There aren't any questions currently that have been posed. Again, if anybody, I know we only have just a couple minutes. If anybody has any last minute questions, happy to take those. Otherwise, if not, again, thank you so much for your presentation today. Very informative, very good information. Appreciate the knowledge. With that, I see no questions. So I hope everyone has a great rest of their day, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.